So Douglas McGregor was just on Tucker Carlson, his 18th episode on Twitter, and he said that NATO would lose a war with Russia. Not making that up. You're going to see it with your own eyes. You're going to see all kinds of other Russian talking points along the way, and I'll chime in periodically and show you why that's not correct. But that's what you're going to see in this video.
Pretty much everything that NBC News and the New York Times have told you about the war in Ukraine is a lie. The Russian army is incompetent, they claim. Ukraine is a democracy. Vladimir Putin is Hitler and he's trying to take over the world. Thankfully, the Ukrainians are winning. None of that is true.
Actually, much of that is true, but Tucker has a very jaded, pro-Russian talking point kind of way of seeing the future. Now, he's going to introduce Douglas McGregor, and I'm going to fast forward through multiple parts because I want you to hear this, and I don't think that you really want to listen to 52 minutes of either Tucker Carlson or McGregor, but you do want to hear these things.
Every claim is false, the last one especially. The Ukrainian army is not winning. In fact, it's losing badly. Ukraine is being destroyed. Its population is being slaughtered in lopsided battles with a technologically superior enemy.
According to Russian talking points, but according to free Western press, that's not what's going on. And I talked about that over the last couple of days and how many Ukrainians have been wounded or killed in the war, or a previous iteration of that where we're looking at how many Russians. But they just keep repeating Russian talking points
to the rest of the globe as refugees. Ukraine is running out of soldiers. As that happens, the question will inevitably arise, who's going to replace them? If the Ukrainians can't beat Putin, who will? The answer, of course, will be us. American troops will fight the Russian army in Eastern Europe. That's most likely. And the assumption is we'll win.
Now, that American troops will be in a hot war with Russia is a standard Russian talking point. On the Ukrainian side, they don't talk like that. They talk about arming Ukrainians so Ukrainians can fight their battle.
But will we win? Probably not, says former Army Colonel Douglas
McGregor,
a decorated combat veteran who advised the Secretary of Defense in the last administration. The U.S., says McGregor, is on the brink of a catastrophic war that could very easily destroy us. Few Americans seem to understand that.
Now, that is a standard Russian talking point that the U.S. is about to get into this war. Those that are supporting Ukraine so Ukrainians can fight, not so that we can fight. There's a difference. But the Russians are trying to back us up by having that kind of sentiment being put forward.
But they should. Doug McGregor is now the CEO of Our Country, Our Choice, and we sat down with him recently. This conversation is worth hearing. Doug McGregor, thanks for joining us. How would you assess and describe the state of the war in Ukraine right now?
That's an important question, and not enough people have good answers at this point. I think all of the lies that have been told for more than a year and a half about the Ukrainians are winning, the Ukrainian cause is just, the Russians are evil, the Russians are incompetent, all of that is collapsing.
Okay, so two things. One, they're not all lies. Some of that is true. Russians are committing war crimes. They are doing terrible things. But all of these lies are collapsing. Look, on week one, go back as far as you can find a Doug McGregor video analyzing the war in Ukraine. The Ukrainians are collapsing. The Ukrainians are collapsing. Like 500 some odd days later, he's still saying the same thing.
And it's collapsing because what's happening on the battlefield is horrific. Ukrainians now, we think, have lost 400,000 men killed.
Okay, that's nonsense. I did a video just the other day showing what the actual, what the free press understands to be the truth, as opposed to a Russian talking point. And if you think that the free press has issues, that's nothing compared to what Russian state media says. 400,000 is ludicrous.
In battle. We were talking about...
And yet Tucker's incredulous about this. Really? That many? How about that? Because Russia, he wants Russia to win. I mean, that's where Tucker Carlson actually is.
350,000 a few months ago. Within the last month of this supposed counteroffensive, which was to sweep the battlefield, they lost at least 40,000 killed. We don't even know how many people have been wounded, but we know that probably upwards of 40 to 50,000 soldiers are amputees.
His figures are absolute nonsense.
We know the hospitals are full. And we know that Ukrainian units at the platoon and company level, that's with anywhere from 50 to 150 to 200 men, are in piecemeal fashion surrendering to the Russians. Not because they don't want to fight, it's because they can't fight anymore. They have so many wounded, they can't evacuate them. And commanders are saying, well, if I can't evacuate my wounded, I'm going to surrender because otherwise the wounded will die. And so they call the Russians, they all speak Russian, and tell them on the radio, look, I've got 50, 60 wounded here. I'm going to surrender because I don't want them to be killed. And the Russians, from the very beginning, have always treated the Ukrainian soldiers very fairly.
Okay, so if you're watching this and you just heard him say that, that's everything that you need to know about McGregor and the veracity. They've always treated the Ukrainians fairly. No, they've not committed any war crimes targeting residential buildings or hospitals or kindergartens or anything along those lines. And they've treated their soldiers fairly. They haven't castrated any. They haven't killed combatants that have surrendered. They haven't done any of that. Okay. This is where McGregor is, but he's about to get even worse.
And very gently. And so they know they're not going to be abused or mistreated. They know they can actually be exchanged for Russian prisoners in the future. So they surrender. And I think we're going to see this army that we've been spending so heavily on increasingly melt away. And at the same time, as we're talking, if you look at this long banana-shaped strip of territory in southern Ukraine that the Russians control, if you go to the northeastern corner of that, south of this city called Kharkiv, there are major offensive operations taking place there right now. And the Ukrainian forces are being swept away in front of the Russians. And again,
Of course, he's continually saying Ukrainians are being swept away. And at a certain point, you just got to wonder, when it doesn't come together, when will it come together? Like it's like he's saying the Ukrainians are losing on a theory that if you dance long enough, it's going to rain.
all of this happens in a way that is just not reported in the West. And in the meantime, rather than admit that this is a terrible tragedy that should be ended on humanitarian grounds, if no other, that the killing should stop, as President Trump said, stop the killing, we're going to continue. And this puts the Russians in the unhappy position of marching further west.
Yeah, the Russians don't want to do that. They never wanted to take any territory. They had to do this, is what he's saying. And by the way, the mainstream media isn't reporting it. It's a standard trope that Russian repeaters, people who repeat Russian talking points, use constantly.
Because from the very beginning, Putin and his advisors were never interested in a war with NATO or the United States. That's why you've had such incrementalism.
And that is true. Like Putin only wanted to deal with Ukraine and knock over Ukraine and take that. He didn't want to tangle with NATO, and he certainly doesn't want NATO supplying Ukraine. And that is a legitimate point.
Slow grind of movement forward, defensive operations for a long period to build up the force, and then continued offensive operations. They have over 300,000 combat troops in reserve in Russia. And I think they're sitting there and not being released to fight because President Putin anticipates the possibility that we will intervene in Western Ukraine.
Or they're too green or poorly trained or not useful or whatever else.
And if we intervene in Western Ukraine, the Russians will be ready for that. And the consequences for us and for NATO will be devastating because we are not ready to fight the Russians.
Okay, now I'm going to repeat what he just said because that's really, really important.
The Russians will be ready for that. And the consequences for us and for NATO will be devastating.
Did you just hear what he said? So he's saying that the consequences for NATO will be devastating, but he's going to go further and say that if NATO and Russia were to go head to head, NATO will lose. Watch this.
Because we are not ready to fight the Russians. Why? Oh, I think the readiness has been on the decline for a long time. You've had an almost steady, uninterrupted decline in the discipline that makes soldiers fight. When you're rewarding people for anything other than demonstrated character, competence, and intelligence. All of those things are demoralizing destructive to military establishments.
And that those are all fair, but to think that the Russians are doing it better when the Russians have pantsed themselves on the world stage when they entered Ukraine and couldn't take it like they with an all-out blitz on the country, I just don't see it.
Because since 2001, most of the fighting has been on a very small scale against a fleeting enemy. You know, running around in sandals with an AK-47, relying heavily on explosives, mines, to kill and maim Americans. About 87% of our losses were really a result of explosives.
Now that's a legitimate figure, but I'm not sure that that's going to mean that the American military, the professional American military, let alone all of NATO, would be at a loss compared to the Russians.
Came from mines. This is not an army that is accustomed to fighting anybody who can fight back. If I were going to compare it to an army, a better comparison would probably be the French army before the Franco-Prussian War, because the French had fought Mexican bandits, Mexican rebels. They'd fought Arab bandits, Arab insurgents. They'd had a little experience fighting disgruntled, demoralized European troops, Austrians in northern Italy, but they hadn't faced a truly modern enemy. But people were convinced that the French army was the greatest army in the world because they'd fought in North Africa, Indochina, Mexico, all over the world. That war was a catastrophe for France.
So if you follow his thinking, then Russia isn't the second army in the world. Russia is the first, the greatest army in the world, displacing the United States. And that's absolutely bizarre.
Persistent surveillance from space, from overhead surveillance, makes everything visible all the time.
And that works on both sides, right? We can see everything the Russians are doing just like they can see everything Ukrainians are doing.
The only limitation on your ability to target and destroy the enemy is ammunition. The Russians, of course, have no shortages whatsoever. You recall at the beginning of this, we have all these shortages, right? The Russians can't keep up with missiles. The Russians can't keep up with shells. Well, they have multiple manufacturing facilities operating 7 days a week and 24 hours a day. We have no surge capacity in the United States. It would take us many, many months to come up to that kind of standard where we could actually compete in high-end conventional warfare. And that's why people like me and others worry that if we get into a confrontation, that we cannot win because the world has changed, warfare has changed, integrated air defenses will knock virtually everything that flies out of the sky, that we will then fall back on a nuclear deterrent.
Okay, he just said that if we were to get into it with Russia, we cannot win.
And that's why people like me and others worry that if we get into a confrontation, that we cannot win.
And then we'd fall back on a nuclear deterrent. Okay? So you heard it from the horse's mouth. We cannot win against Russia without nuclear weapons. And again, this is Russian talking points, like 101.
A tactical nuclear weapon that says, if you keep advancing, we'll have to use a nuclear weapon. We don't want to go there because the notion that there are so-called tactical nukes, you've heard that expression?
Yes.
Oh, that's just a little nuke. So that won't precipitate a major war. The use of any nuclear weapon is going to precipitate escalation very rapidly.
Absolutely. Nobody argues with that, but nobody on the American NATO Ukraine side is arguing that either. Only Russian state media is making that case, and their repeaters like McGregor and Scott Ritter.
Opponents will assume that if they don't use their nuclear weapons, they're going to lose them. So we're living in a terrible dilemma right now. The smartest thing that we can do is end this war.
Which is also a Russian talking point. That's what they want to do. They want to freeze the conflict, take the land, and say, so sorry, Ukraine, you can have peace as long as you give us this land. It's nonsense.
What is Russia's objective, do you believe? Assuming that objectives change over the course of a war.
Of course. Well, the original objective, obviously, was very different. I mean, if they'd made peace with the Russians back in, let's say, March or April, I think the Russians would have retained very little territory, probably only Luhansk and Donetsk, the two.
Which is more territory than they should have been able to retain. That's not okay. You're wantonly violating international law and then McGregor's an apologist for the Russians, saying they should be able to have kept it.
The so-called breakaway provinces. And I think there would have been guarantees of neutrality for Ukraine.
And you know how well those guarantees worked with the Budapest Memorandum.
And guarantees of equal rights before the law for Russians. And that's what people don't understand. Most of this has to do with abuse meted out to Russians in Ukraine by the Ukrainian government.
In some degree, he's correct in the sense that Russians, laws about Russian language and that kind of thing were put on the books. After the Russians put laws that you can't speak Ukrainian on the books when Russia dominated Ukraine. Like, he's forgetting that whole swath of history, and you can't do that if you're going to be fair. He's being terribly unfair.
And this, of course, is this radical nationalist government that came to power in Kiev.
As opposed to the radical nationalist government in Moscow.
2014. And they almost immediately, as soon as that government came into power, they started launching a war against the so-called breakaway provinces. And
all Russian talking points. They didn't do that. The Russians invaded, and then you had invaded into those so-called breakaway provinces. And then the Ukrainians had a different problem set to deal with.
Putin kept trying and trying and trying. The Minsk Accords were another good example. Trying to get to a solution that would not involve confrontation. Now we know, of course, thanks to Angela Merkel.
I like that he can even say this with a straight face is baffling to me.
German Chancellor, that the Minsk Accords were just a ruse, a way to kill time and give the Ukrainians more time to build up their forces.
And that was not great explanation by Angela Merkel by saying what she said, but it wasn't just a ruse. It was trying to get to some kind of legitimate peace in the meantime so that cooler heads could prevail. But yes, that has been picked up and recarried and said again and again and again in Russian state media.
To build up their forces for what? And it's pretty clear they were building up for an offensive against Russia.
Because Russia's on their land.
And of course, the next step was that we bring in our missiles and station them in eastern Ukraine, which puts them in a couple of minutes away from all of Russia's cities and all of Russia's nuclear deterrent.
Okay, so let's think through that. I don't know how fast a nuclear missile would travel. I would imagine it goes pretty quick. I don't think it matters whether it's in Finland, the Baltic states, Poland, or Ukraine. It's still getting to its target really, really quick. So this idea that, oh, now that it's in Ukraine, it's too close is silly. The math doesn't add up.
So this was unacceptable. So that original deal is gone now. And the question is, what will the Russians accept? Well, I think they're going to demand that whatever remains of Ukraine, rump Ukraine is what most people are calling it now, most of what's probably west of the Dnieper River, has to be.
That's what Russia is calling it, not anyone in the West. I've never even seen the term in any Western newspaper.
Neutral. It can't be part of NATO. The Russians will never tolerate NATO forces on Ukrainian soil because we've demonstrated.
Did you hear that little slip? He said, "We will."
It can't be part of NATO. The Russians will never tolerate NATO forces on Ukrainian soil.
The Russians will never tolerate that. Like, that's the way he's thinking, as if he's the Russians.
Conclusively, that we are fundamentally hostile to Russia. So that's the minimal requirement. How that's governed, that's another question. Who knows?
But it wasn't always the case. I mean, for a long time, it was just ignoring Russia until Russia has proven that you can't ignore it.
Because I'm sure Moscow would want to have some say in that government and who is there to ensure that behind the scenes they are not once again subjected to the treatment that we subjected to them to in the Minsk Accords.
Of course, they want to control Ukraine. That's exactly right. He's articulating it exactly. And Ukraine doesn't want to be controlled by Russia. That's the bottom line.
What is the Ukrainian objective?
I think more and more Ukrainians just want to survive this. And that's becoming very hard. And Zelensky and the radicals around him are basically committed to fighting this war to the last Ukrainian.
Yeah, so that seems pretty unfair that the Ukrainians don't actually want to fight, and it's just Zelensky making his people because he's mean, and that's not true at all.
And of course, I'm sure that Mr. Zelensky and his friends are anxious at some point to retire to their estates in Florida or Venice or Cyprus.
And this is another Russian talking point that they're just a bunch of corrupt people that want to, milk the people and live on the high life.
To collect on the billions that they've managed to steal or siphon from all the aid that we've provided. Remember, Ukraine is probably one of the most corrupt places in the world.
Russia's a lot more corrupt.
A friend of mine who had spent time in the old Soviet Union and also lived in Mexico came back from a visit to Mexico, and he said, it's hard to believe this, but Ukraine is more corrupt than Mexico.
And Russia's more corrupt than Ukraine.
Wow. And I think that's true. So this is a world-class disaster. 14 million Ukrainians have left the nation, presumably never to return, because when they're asked in Germany or France or Croatia or Spain or wherever they go, we will never go back.
Now, I don't know who he's talking to, but many Ukrainians can't wait to get back to a peaceful Ukraine.
So what are you going to do with this country? And then, of course, we had the usual suspects, the great agricultural business conglomerates, along with BlackRock, who have their eyes on the fertile Ukraine ground in western Ukraine. I suppose there'll be a big effort to get control of that in some fashion. That may not work, though, once this war ends with a complete and utter defeat of the Ukrainian regime.
Well, I don't think the complete and utter defeat of the Ukrainian regime is in the cards. I see it exactly the opposite way, but he's assuming that is what is going to happen.
Who is Zelensky? Exactly. How would you characterize
Okay, as if Tucker Carlson doesn't know who Zelensky is. He's going to just he's inviting McGregor to give his talking points. Okay, we're going to stop there because, frankly, you don't want to go through anymore. I already listened to it once, and I'm only 15 minutes out of the 52 minutes in, and I don't want to listen to it again. But yeah, I mean, that McGregor actually made the case that the West would lose to Russia in a war if they got into it, and then it would necessarily become a nuclear exchange. Okay, you heard it yourself. You can decide what you think about it, but I want to thank you for having the patience to listen to this. Thank you for the likes. That would help this on YouTube's algorithm. Subscribe if you want to hear more from me about analysis about Ukraine. And thank you for being the kind of person that cares about Ukraine. I'll be back tomorrow. Hope you will be too.